unlocking queenside influence early. This opening sets a dynamic stage for positional maneuvering and potential pawn structure imbalances. Unlocking the kingside with a fianchetto, g6 prepares to eye the long diagonal, potentially challenging white's central control. Developing the knight to f3 offers white flexible central control while preparing for kingside castling. Establishing fianchettoed bishops often dictates pawn structure, aiming to control long diagonals and create outward pressure. Preparing to fianchetto your bishop solidifies kingside control and eyes the long diagonal, promising active play. Developing this knight prepares to contest central control and potentially launch an attack down the kingside. Developing the bishop to this diagonal intensifies pressure along the long diagonal, aiming to seize control of key squares and prepare for an eventual kingside pawn storm. Securing the monarch immediately establishes a safe harbor, preparing for central development and potential peace maneuvering in the subsequent phases of this English opening encounter. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now prepares for kingside expansion or a central pawn push, subtly reinforcing the central control established by the fianchettoed bishop. Solidifying the pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the queen while preparing a potential e5 break. Solidifying the center and preparing for further development, nc3 offers flexibility, either supporting d4 or rerouting the knight to a more active square. Initiating a pawn confrontation in the center, black immediately challenges white's central space and opens diagonals for their pieces. This bold central thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses in their pawn structure. It's a declaration of intent. Black isn't content with a passive setup and seeks active counterplay, forcing white to react decisively. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust is crucial, aiming to disrupt black's fianchetto setup and open lines for piece activity. White decisively challenges black's pawn chain, forcing a confrontation that will define the central pawn structure and dictate attacking prospects. The board's geometry shifts dramatically as white seeks to exploit potential weaknesses created by this aggressive advance. Securing the center and preparing for a central pawn break anchors black's position. Pushing the pawn to d5 seizes more territory and immediately creates a pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's central mobility and potentially create weaknesses. This advance might look simple, but it fundamentally alters the game's character, forcing black to reconsider their development and counterplay. It's a move that demands careful assessment of the pawn structure's future, anticipating how the resulting positions might favor either side in the long run. Rerouting that knight offers a subtle yet vital reevaluation of central control, perhaps preparing a future c5 thrust to challenge white's space advantage. It sacrifices immediate central presence for a more flexible structure, aiming to avoid being suffocated. Initiating a strategic retreat of the knight, this maneuver subtly reroutes its path, aiming for a less congested central square and potentially supporting a kingside pawn push later on. The piece's repositioning also vacates the central file for other pieces. Unlocking the queenside begins with this pawn thrust, aiming to create space and prevent white's knight from easily reaching c4, while also preparing for potential pressure along the file. Shifting the knight to d3 aims to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential kingside expansion, while also opening a path for the queen to join the action. Shifting that knight to the edge seems like a curious retreat, but it prepares for potential activity on the queen side, perhaps eyeing the c4 square or aiming to avoid white's centralized pieces. This maneuver sacrifices immediate central influence for a long-term positional plan. Pinning that knight against the queen, white aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and create immediate pressure on the queen side, potentially forcing concessions in piece placement or pawn structure. Black seeks to activate the queen, potentially redeploying it to the kingside or supporting a queenside pawn push, while also clearing the e8 square for a bishop or rook, though this maneuver temporarily concedes central space and can feel somewhat passive if not followed up energetically. White anchors the queen to a secure defensive post, preparing to contest the central files and subtly reinforcing the knight on d3. A patient maneuver, shifting the knight's influence to a less explored diagonal, aiming to reinforce the kingside and prepare for potential advances on the queenside pawn chain, hinting at a subtle repositioning to avoid immediate tactical skirmishes while exploring avenues for piece development. White aims to solidify the center and initiate a queenside expansion, a common strategy in this king's Indian setup. Pushing this pawn forward creates a solid pawn chain anchored by the d5 pawn, restricting black's knight on b8 and potentially hindering its development to c6. It also prepares for a potential kingside attack by clearing the way for f4, aiming to gain more space and initiative. This move subtly overextends the pawn structure, though, and could become a target if black can generate sufficient counterplay. Unleashing a daring pawn storm on the kingside, black seeks to shatter white's central pawn chain and create immediate attacking chances, a bold gambit that could lead to either swift victory or tactical unraveling. Sharpening the central pawn chain aggressively, f4 aims to pry open the kingside and exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled king, though it invites potential counterplay along the e-file if black can consolidate. Hoping to disrupt white's kingside ambitions, black bravely challenges the bishop and aims to prevent the looming f5 push. But this might be a premature commitment that weakens the kingside structure, potentially opening avenues for white's pieces to exploit the light squares. Unlocking the kingside and potentially exposing the black monarch, this bishop repositioning aims to exploit the newly created tension and black's somewhat uncoordinated pieces, creating a direct confrontation that could quickly escalate into sharp tactical exchanges or a strategic repositioning of forces. Diverting the knight from its defensive post on c5 to the somewhat awkward a6 square opens up the c-file for potential pressure, but the bishop on g7 feels a bit less supported. Instead of consolidating the center, this maneuver feels more like a preemptive strike, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain. The knight's journey to a6 appears to be a pawn sacrifice in disguise, seeking active counterplay by threatening to pierce the queenside. The elimination of black's knight opens a diagonal for white's bishop and simplifies the position, aiming to leverage the central pawn majority. A significant pawn exchange unfolds, immediately altering the central structure and potentially opening lines for aggressive piece play. A strategic repositioning, the knight abandons its central outpost to eye the queenside's potential weaknesses and create a blockade on the b5 square, aiming to stifle black's queenside expansion and perhaps initiate a flank attack by supporting an eventual c5 push. Embracing the defender's role, this rook slides to a potentially crucial defensive post, bolstering the kingside and preparing to swing over to the kingside if the center collapses, while also eyeing the open f-file for later offensive actions should the opportunity arise. Radiating pressure along the e-file, this deployment now sets the stage for further central infiltration or potential flank assaults, subtly influencing black's developing pieces and hinting at a more dynamic middle game engagement. Challenging the center with a pawn thrust, black immediately injects dynamism into the game, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for their pieces, particularly the queen poised on e8. Unleashing the e-pawn creates an open path for the rook, directly challenging the defender of black's king. Opening the f-file now offers a direct assault on white's weakened kingside structure, bypassing the pawn wall and aiming for immediate activity against the monarch. The bishop's capture on f1, a seemingly simple recapture, dramatically alters the pawn structure and opens a long diagonal for the white king, demanding a swift reassessment of defensive postures. The queen's bold re-entry into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially threaten the king's safety, ignites a fascinating positional struggle. It's a decision that sacrifices immediate pawn material for increased attacking potential and aims to exploit the lingering weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure, forcing white to confront active counterplay. Unleashing the knight to c7 cracks open the defender's queenside structure, targeting a precarious pawn and threatening to infiltrate further, creating a significant imbalance. Sacrificing the b-pawn to challenge the exposed white knight and potentially open lines towards white's king demonstrates a bold counterattacking spirit. Embracing aggressive pawn thrusts, White aims to pry open the kingside, creating avenues for attack and potentially trapping black's underdeveloped pieces in a spatial squeeze. Sacrificing the bishop here opens up the king's defenses significantly, creating dangerous attacking possibilities along the reopened diagonal and forcing white to constantly calculate potential discovered attacks and sacrifices, ultimately shifting the focus from material balance to dynamic compensation and initiative. Navigating the intricate web of central tension, this maneuver seizes a critical outpost, aiming to disrupt black's rook activity and exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop. Seizing the undefended pawn on b2 injects immediate tactical fireworks, creating a complex pawn structure that black must navigate with extreme care, as the pawn storm on the kingside has now been somewhat blunted by the exchange of material. Reclaiming the piece and simplifying, white tidies up the material imbalance, forcing a sequence that will soon lead to a more open board and a potentially favorable endgame given black's slightly uncoordinated pieces. Black liquidates material, accepting a potentially dangerous pawn sacrifice to simplify into an endgame where white's passed pawns on the kingside might be less of an immediate threat. The knight's daring lunge to d6, a bold sacrifice of material, aims to disrupt black's consolidated queenside and open critical lines towards the enemy king, potentially creating unstoppable passed pawns or tactical chaos. Unveiling a desperate attempt to disrupt white's now solid pawn structure, this check forces a painful concession and exposes the black king to a terrifying degree. Stabilizing the structure after the exchange, aiming to consolidate the material advantage. Unleashing a daring counterstroke, black injects immediate dynamism into a previously stagnant position by reactivating the knight from its somewhat passive post, aiming to disrupt white's rook on the c-file and exploit potential weaknesses around the white king. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside, this exchange simplifies the position while setting up a crucial pawn race, hoping to leverage the advanced passed pawn. A forced endgame transition ensues as the pawn recaptures, offering a chance to consolidate black's central advantage and potentially exploit white's exposed king. A daring gamble to seize the initiative, exploiting the exposed white king and aiming to disrupt black's coordination with a dynamic pawn sacrifice. Reclaiming the open file for the rook immediately redirects its offensive potential, preparing to challenge the isolated pawn and creating dynamic counterplay against white's compromised structure. A brilliant trap sprung, catching the enemy king in a mating net with the pawn breakthrough forcing the queen trade. Now this knight's sacrifice not only clears the path for the queen, but also leverages the newly opened diagonal, setting up a devastating battery that will overwhelm black's defenses. Sacrificing the bishop here, black concedes a decisive material advantage, opening the f-file for white's rook and exposing the king to immediate danger. Sacrificing the rook to eliminate a dangerous knight opens up the king's escape route and forces an exchange that leads directly into a favorable endgame for white. A desperate attempt to stir complications, though the king's exposed position on f7 invites further danger with white's active pieces. The rook's placement on the 8th rank now exerts significant pressure on black's weak pawn structure and offers white a chance to consolidate their material advantage and initiate a decisive endgame. Sacrificing the pawn to activate the rook on the 7th rank creates a dynamic imbalance, forcing white to carefully defend against potential discoveries and mating threats along the open file. Recapturing the pawn with the rook decisively clears the 7th rank for a powerful incursion, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially force a mating net or win further material through its aggressive positioning. The king steps out of shadow into the uncertain light of the middle game, a necessary but risky gambit to escape the battery on the d-file. Now white forces the black king back into an exposed position, sacrificing temporary material gain for positional dominance and the elimination of active black counterplay. King's flight is perilous. This repositioning aims to escape the rook's harassment and find sanctuary behind its own pawns, preparing for a desperate endgame struggle where every tempo counts. The rook's repositioning to b1 aims to solidify white's material advantage, and prepare for a final clampdown on black's isolated pawn, potentially leading to a swift endgame conversion where white's better-placed pieces will dictate the tempo. Suddenly, the game erupts into a queen sacrifice, a desperate attempt to force a perpetual check and salvage a draw from a materially disadvantaged position after white's knight boldly infiltrated the queenside. Ridding the board of that pesky passed pawn on d2 is paramount, securing a more manageable endgame for white. The bishop's journey culminates in a decisive interception, a final act of disruption against the now exposed king as the queens depart the board. Solidifying control of the central files after the queen exchange, this move prepares to sweep the rook across the board, aiming to dislodge the isolated pawns and exploit the open nature of the endgame. Pushing the pawn forward on the queen side, black aims to create an outpost for their bishop or to force white to commit their rook to a passive square, potentially securing more space and restricting white's piece mobility on that flank. A bold repositioning, this bishop aims to disrupt black's centralized queen and create a powerful outpost on the light squares, forcing a tactical reassessment of the board. Unleashing the bishop to a more active diagonal now forces white to react, potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure as they address the immediate threat to their king's safety. Opening the path for the queen to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the queen side, while simultaneously freeing the bishop on b4 to influence the center adds a new layer of complexity. A final desperate lunge to activate the bishop, but the unleashed queen's attack on the white king is too late. The passed pawn has been successfully cornered and neutralized, leaving black with a depleted army and insufficient force to challenge the inevitable promotion. Seizing the d-file immediately after black's pawn promotion presents white with a compelling opportunity to disrupt black's suddenly exposed monarch, potentially forcing crucial defensive concessions or creating avenues for further tactical complications. The bishop retreats, acknowledging the lost initiative and seeking a safer outpost after a series of aggressive exchanges that have complicated the pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside advance with this pawn push aims to restrict black's bishop and potentially create a passed pawn, although it sacrifices some immediate attacking potential for long-term positional pressure. The king cautiously steps out, seeking sanctuary from the looming threat of the white bishop while simultaneously aiming to activate itself for the endgame skirmish ahead, potentially aiming to bolster the weak pawns on the kingside. Securing the king's safety now becomes paramount, preparing for potential counterplay as the board simplifies. The black king makes a brave foray, seeking to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create an outpost on the 6th rank. Clearing a path for the king to potentially activate, this rook-pawn push aims to create a safe square, though it does weaken the kingside pawn structure. The bishop's sudden sortie to d4 forces white's king into a more exposed position, disrupting its tentative safety and creating potential weaknesses around the monarch that black can exploit in the ensuing endgame maneuvering. The king abandons its protective pawn shield, venturing into the storm where checks and threats abound. A bold recapture, sacrificing the bishop to maintain a passed pawn's advance, but opening up lines for white's king.